Hilchos Kiddush Hachodesh Perek Tisha Asar. The laws of sanctifying the new month, chapter 19, the final chapter. Today we are concluding the entire set of halachot that was a bit complex, but we made it through. And today we're going to see an example of how the Rambam strictly brings down in his book things that are relevant to halacha, things that are relevant to understanding Jewish law. For the last 18 days, I told you many times that the Galgal HaMazalot, this ecliptic, the band of stars which we use to identify the movement of the sun and the moon, I told you that it's inclined relative to the earth 23.5 degrees. Many times we talked about that. And it was relevant to understanding the how and the why of many of the Rambam's calculations. But the Rambam himself never says that until this chapter. Until today, chapter 19, this is the first time he's going to tell us about the inclination of the ecliptic. And that's because, technically, if you learned the Rambam until now, you didn't have to know this. All you have to know is the technical calculations, follow where the sun is, which mazal it is, and based on that, add and subtract and add and subtract. You don't actually have to know how the universe looks. It's only for today's chapter that you have to know it. And therefore the Rambam only says it today. I think it's just a fascinating concept where we see that the Rambam only writes what you have to know for the relevant halacha. The fact that the moon is inclined relative to the ecliptic 5 degrees more, that he said earlier. Think about it. If I was teaching astronomy class, I would first say this, and then I would say that the moon is inclined further. The Rambam only gives us the moon's inclination because that was relevant in chapter 16. Today, when this is relevant, he puts this. So I think it's fascinating that the Rambam ends off with this concept, even though l'chayra it's so basic, because in this topic it's relevant, so you bring it here. And the Rambam tells us the following: Halacha Aleph, Lefisha Amru Chachamim, because the sages have told us, that among the things that they used to check the witnesses who saw the new moon, one of the questions they used to ask was, they would say to them, to which direction was the moon turning? That was one of the questions we saw in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Kosher be'enai, therefore, says the Rambam, it's kosher, it's fitting in my eyes, to let you know how to figure out which way the moon will be facing. In other words, the Rambam is going to address this question. When you see the new moon, which way are the horns of its crescent going to be facing? Are you going to see them facing straight up, like in the middle? Are you going to see them facing to the right, facing to the left? This is not relevant at all to the fact that the moon is going to be sighted. This is a separate question, which way it's going to be facing. But the Rambam says, nevertheless, I want to tell you how this works. I'm not going to be super precise about these calculations. It doesn't help, it doesn't benefit the sighting at all. Whether the moon will be sighted actually, that's based on the other calculations. This is a separate bonus point. The beginning of understanding how this calculation works is to first know the inclination of the constellations. And the Rambam explains what that means. The orbit that passes through the center of the Galgal HaMazalot. Remember, the Galgal HaMazalot is just 12 groups of stars that form a belt, that form a path for the planets, and the sun goes exactly in the middle of them. If you can draw a line halfway through the groups of stars, that's where the sun travels. So that circle which passes through the middle of the Mazalot, Shaba Mahalech HaShemesh, upon which the sun travels, Eino Iveres be'emtza ha'olam mechatzia mizrach lechatzia ma'irav, does not go around the world from due east to due west. Elonoitahi me'ala kav hashava hamisabev be'emtza ha'olam, it's inclined from above the equator or below the equator, which the equator does surround the world at its belly. Keneged tzafin v'darim, it's inclined towards north and towards south. Half of it turns to the north and half of it turns to the south. And like any circle that's inclined to another circle, the Rambam tells us, there are 2 points along the ecliptic, along the Galgal HaMazalot, where it does meet the equator, which goes exactly around the world, in the middle of the world. The one point is the beginning of Aries. That's around here on this side. And the second point, which is exactly 180 degrees opposite it, would be the beginning of Libra. So you have then 6 constellations are inclined to the north. Mitchilas Tale ad Soif Besula, from the beginning of Aries till the end of Virgo. The Shisha Noites L'Darim, and the other 6 are inclined to the south. Mitchilas Mazel Miznayim ad Soif Mazel Dagim, from the beginning of Libra till the end of Pisces. Halacha Daled, Umireish Mazel Tale Yaschilu Hamazolois Lintes Ma'at Ma'at. Beginning with Aries is the point where the constellations begin to incline, little by little, and to distance themselves from the equator towards north, ad Reish Sarta, until the beginning of Cancer. And the beginning of Cancer is inclined, distant from the equator, towards north, around 23.5 degrees. At that point, the constellations then begin to get closer, little by little, to the equator, ad Reish Moiznayim, till the top of the beginning of Libra, which is exactly aligned with the equator. From the beginning of Libra, that's when the constellations begin to incline a little by little towards the south, ad Reish Gedi, till the beginning of Capricorn, which is 90 degrees downwards. And the beginning of Capricorn is the most distant point from the equator, L'Ruach Darim, to the south, also 23.5 degrees. And then again, the constellations begin to rise and get closer and closer towards the equator, ad Reish Tala, till again the beginning of Aries, which is 0 degrees, where it meets the equator once again. Halacha Hey, Nimtza, it turns out, Reish Tala v'Reish Moiznayim misabev ala kav hashaveh. The beginning of Aries, the beginning of Libra are turning. In other words, they are always aligned with the equator exactly. And when reality turns the entirety of reality, when the Galgal Hayomi turns all of reality from east to west, the points of Tala and Moiznayim are actually aligned with the equator. And therefore, when the sun is at both of these points, the sun itself will not be inclined to the north or to the south. It's going to rise in due east, set in due west. And day and night are going to be equal in all of the populated area in the world, because the sun is aligned with the equator. It's rising in the east, setting in the west. 6 a.m. is sunrise, 6 p.m. is sunset. So now it becomes clear to you, if you understand this inclination, it's clear, shekol maila umaila, mimaila samazola, is that every single degree of the ecliptic, of the circle of the mazalot, noita litzafin iladarim, is either inclined towards north or towards south. V'yesh linitiyasa shir, and there is a certain amount of how much it is inclined. The maximum inclination will not be more than 23.5 degrees. And like the Rambam did with the moon, when the moon is a little bit inclined, he gave us how much it's inclined at each point. So he goes over here as well. These are the amounts of the inclination according to the number of degrees of each constellation. We're going to begin with the beginning of Aries. Eser Miles, 10 degrees in to Aries. Nitiyasam, Arba Miles, is inclined from the equator 4 degrees. Esrim Miles, you keep climbing, 20 degrees on Aries. Nitiyasam Shmeina Miles is now 8 degrees away from the equator. Shleishim Miles, 30 degrees, that's the end of Aries. Nitiyasam Achas Esrim Miles Omechatza is inclined 11.5 degrees from the equator, to the north again. V'Arbaim Miles, at 40 degrees, 10 degrees into Taurus, Nitiyasam Chamesh Esrei Miles is now inclined 15 degrees from the equator. Chamishim Miles, 50 degrees, Nitiyasam Shmeina Esrei Miles is 18 degrees inclined from the equator. Shishim Miles at 60 degrees, the end of Taurus, Nitiyasam Esrei Miles is now 20 degrees inclined from the equator. Shivim Miles, 70 degrees, the beginning of Gemini, Nitiyasam Shtayim Ve'esrei Miles is 22 degrees inclined from the equator. Shmeinim Miles, 80 degrees. Nitiyasam Shalish Ve'esim Miles is 23 degrees inclined from the equator. Tishim Miles at 90 degrees. Nitiyasam Shalish Ve'esim Miles V'chatzi Miles is now the maximum 23.5 inclination. Ches V'im Yiyu Achadim B'minyan. If you're looking for a single number, a single unit, not 80, not 90, let's say 85. Tikach Lahem Manasa Mibein Shtei Anitiyos, you will be able to get the number of the angular inclination based on the two tens inclination. You can interpolate the number. As you've already learned with the sun and the moon. What would that look like practically? Chamish Miles, when it comes to 5 degrees, Nitiyasam Shtei Miles. the inclination will be 2 degrees, because 0 degrees, of course, is 0 degrees inclination. 10 degrees is 4 degrees inclination. So 5 in between is 2 degrees. For example, if it would be 23 degrees, you would know that it's 9 degrees inclination, because 20 degrees is 8 degrees inclination, 30 degrees is 11.5 degrees inclination. Go for every single one, and by 23 you get to 9. The same thing you should do with any single number, together with its tens. Once you know the table from 1 to 90 of inclinations, you can know all the inclinations, as it was with the moon's inclination off of the ecliptic. You could know with the ecliptic's inclination off of the equator, because again, it's all a table of 90 degrees. Once you hit 90, now you're going back. So 100 degrees would be the same as 80 degrees. 110, same as 70. 120, same as 60, etc. The Rambam uses his own illustration. From 90 to 180, well, all you have to do is subtract that number from 180, and you will know how many degrees it's inclined. From 180 to 270, simply subtract 180 from the number, and whatever is left, use the table to figure out the inclination. From 270 to 360, just subtract the number from 360, and whatever remains, follow the table, and you will know the inclination, and that will be the inclination of the number that you have, with no subtraction and no addition. Halacha Yud. Now we want to bring it back to the moon. You know that the ecliptic is 23.5 degrees inclined. We know that the moon is 5 degrees further inclined. So if you ever want to know how far is the moon from the equator, chapter 16, we're learning about how far the moon is from the ecliptic. If you want to go further and know how far is the moon from the equator, north or south, first figure out wherever the true position of the moon is, how far is that inclined off of the equator? And whether it's to the north or to the south. In other words, let's say if the moon is in Te'omim, is in Gemini, that's a northerly inclined mazal, and figure out what exactly is the inclination for every part of Te'omim, let's say. And then, figure out the initial moon's latitude, in other words, the distance of the moon from the ecliptic, and see if it's north or south. And then do simple arithmetic. If both the moon's inclination off of the ecliptic and the current position of the moon's inclination off of the equator are both to the same direction, if it was both north or both south, so the moon is either, let's say the moon is over here in a northern degree, and it's also inclined to the north, or it's in the south, and it's also inclined to the south, add them both together. But if they're in two opposite directions, which could happen, one is to the south, one is to the north. Let's say the moon is in this mazal, it's in a northern mazal, but it's inclined to the south. Or it's in a southern mazal, but inclined to the north. So then, subtract the smaller number from the greater number. And the remainder is the distance of the moon from the equator in the direction which had the higher number. Ketzad, that I'm going to visualize this. What does this look like? Let's use our night of sighting, 1 month from the starting point. And we want to know how far was the moon inclined from the equator on this night. Second day of the month of Iyar of this year, 4938. You already know, based on the previous chapters, where was the moon located? 19 degrees into the Mazal of Taurus, about 18 degrees inclined to the equator. In other words, the sun was over here in Mazal Shor. Shor is at the point that it was 18 degrees from the equator. But the inclination of the moon off of the ecliptic was southerly. Was about 4 degrees south. So we have 18 degrees north, 4 degrees south. Subtract the smaller number from the greater number. 18 minus 4 is how much? Yishayar arba esrei mailis, remaining 14 degrees. That's the distance of the moon from the equator. Nimtza hayareach rachek me'al hakav hashava 14 miles l'ruach tzafon. That means that the moon is going to be 14 degrees off of the equator to the north, even though it was inclined to the south of the ecliptic. But relative to the equator, it's inclined to the north. Because the greater number, the 18, was a northern inclination. Again, this whole thing is all very approximate, with no precision, because it will not help you to determine whether or not you will sight the moon. It will tell you when you sight the moon, which direction will you sight it in, but it won't tell you whether or not you can sight the moon. So halacha yud beis im tirtza leida le'ezor ruach miruches ha'olam yirah hayareach leite. If you want to then go and answer the High Court's question to know which direction will the moon be facing, tachshay v'teida merchaker me'al hakav hashava. You must use this calculation to understand how far it is from the equator. Im yiyeh al hakav hashava. If it comes out that it's exactly aligned with the equator, oikarav mimenu b'shtayim or shalish miles b'tzafin nebedarim, or maximum 2 degrees, 3 degrees north or south. You're going to see it directly due west, and its blemished part, in other words, the Rambam describes it as, this is the blemished part. The bowl in the crescent is the blemish. So the horns of its crescent, exactly, what you can't see, is going to be facing east. The horns of its crescent are going to be directly facing east. Because if this picture is you looking out to the west, the sun just set below the horizon. So the moon, which is following the sun and is aligned with the equator, is going to be seen in due west with the horns of its crescent facing exactly east.
Exactly east?
Yeah, because it's going towards the east. If sunset is in the west, where are the horns facing?
Oh.
They're facing east.
Right, it's facing really up but east.
Yeah. Yud Gimel, v'im yiyarachek me'al hakav hashava l'tzfayin ha'olam, if your calculations reveal that the moon is actually inclined north of the equator, you're going to see the moon in the northwest, not in due west. And since the sun is over here, and you're going to see the moon to the right of the sun, only the part that's facing the sun gets lit up. So the crescent is going to look differently, right? The Rambam says, and the horns of the crescent are going to be facing eastward, but southeastward. Because again, the moon is in the northwest corner. So where are the horns of the crescent facing? To the southwest, to the southeast, I'm sorry.
Southeast.
Remember, east means upwards, because away from the horizon is going east.
And there is south.
And there is south. Sending the opposite. Yudalit. If the calculations reveal that the moon is southerly inclined to the equator, that's on the left side over here. You're going to see it in the southwest, over here, to the left of the sun. And therefore the horns of the crescent are going to be facing east, again, away from the sun, but to the northeast this time. The more the distance that the moon has from the equator, the more the horns of the crescent will be turned towards that other direction. So this closes the discussion on the question that the court used to ask, which direction was the moon facing? This is what they wanted to know. They wanted to know that the witnesses really see the moon. They would know if the moon's crescent would be facing directly upwards, to the side, to the other side. They would know this. And they would ask the witnesses. The witnesses would, based on their testimony, would be decided to be true or not. Another thing the court used to ask the witnesses was, they would ask them, how tall was the moon? Right here you can see, this is the moon's crescent as it is high up in the sky. It's one night. Same moon's crescent, now it's very low down in the sky.
From the horizon, how high?
Yes, they would ask them from the horizon, how high did it look?
What's the end of the month?
So the Rambam says, "V'davar zeh yivada mikesha sariyah." You could know this based on the arc of sighting. After all the adjustment, chapter 17, back and forth, the final arc of sighting, the final distance between the moon and the sun, will tell you how high the moon will be. Because again, the height of the moon means how far it is from the sun. The closer it is to the sun, the lower it will be in the horizon. The further it is from the sun, the further it will be from the horizon. When the final arc of sighting is short, the moon will appear very close to the earth, as in this picture. But when it's going to be a long arc of sighting and there's more time for the moon to get far from the sun, it's going to appear, as in this picture, higher up from the earth. Ulefi oirech keshes hariyah, ulefi gavei mi'ala aretz b'riyah so'inayim, and again, according to the length of the arc of sighting, that will determine the length or the height of the moon's sighting based on a person's eyesight. And the Rambam concludes, Harei be'arnu cheshbeinos kol hadrachim shetzrichin lahem b'yidiyas hariyah v'chakiras ha'edim. We've now explained the calculations of all the methods that are needed to know whether or not you're going to sight the new moon, or how to investigate the witnesses. So everything should be known to he who wants to understand, and nothing should be lacking in the paths of Torah. So nobody has to go checking in other books to figure out the truth of Torah's wisdom. It's all here. As the pasuk says, Dirshu me al sefer Hashem ukra'u. Inquire from the book of God and read from there. Achas meheino leina adara. So nothing should be lacking from the Torah. And the Rebbe says there are some things that the Rambam included in these halachot that aren't even in the Gemara. And nevertheless, by putting it into the Rambam, which is a book of Torah, he converted it into Torah. It becomes, as the verse says, Dirshu me al sefer Hashem. Whatever we learned here becomes part of the book of Hashem, because astronomy, as it's studied relative to halacha, becomes halacha. And with this, Brich Rachamana Desaya, and blessed is the merciful and grants us assistance. Mazal Tov for concluding Hilchos Kiddush Hachodesh.